welcome back to our Fireside Chats. We've got a special episode for you today. We're coming to you on a Monday because we're actually doing our first in-person Fireside Chat, coming to you live from Johannesburg, South Africa. And this is going to be a very special episode because we're going to be talking about CX. So sharpen your pencils. We are going to be taking live questions. Get your questions ready about CX because we've got a very special guest today. Kendall Rÿnders is a CX expert from Ask Afrika and is going to be joining us to tell us about her career and her journey. It's actually pretty amazing. Kendall just won the latest GreenBook honouree award. So we've got a very special conversation today. And Kendall, thanks for joining us live. Welcome to the show.
It's a pleasure. Thank you for having me.
Absolutely. Absolutely. I'm so happy that we can finally do one of these in person live. You guys can't see this, but there's a beautiful, gorgeous day in Johannesburg today with a great view. But, obviously the sun is washing us out. So we kind of turned the other way. You can see a little bit of the reflection there. So don't be too jealous that we get to enjoy the sunshine today. But Kendall, obviously, what an amazing award and honoree to be in the GreenBook Awards. Tell us a little bit about how your career got started in research. Where did this all begin?
Sure, where do I even start? So I actually did my master's in research psychology because I just found a passion for research. And then I started my research career in innovation research, funny enough. So helping businesses with relaunches, restages, and mostly up in Africa. Fascinating, completely different to South Africa, and obviously completely different to most of the countries in the world. And it was mostly within the FMCG space, but it was quite interesting because when I eventually moved into customer experience, there were a lot of links that I could actually draw. So if you think about it, any research that is done is voice of customer. So you're actually providing the customer's voice back, whether the question is, do I want to purchase this product, right, or how satisfied are you with the experience that you've been given based off of whatever touch points or whatever journey you're experiencing. So I suppose I've always kind of been in providing voices to people, and it's one of my passions. I did dabble in business development a little bit, and I think it's always good to have that backing so that you know how sales works. Recommendation for anyone out there who's got a career in research, definitely try sales a little bit. It's a very good experience. You learn a lot very quickly. And I think that it also linked back to customer experience quite nicely because of the benefits from a business perspective that customer experience brings.
Right.
And then about 2 years ago, I started at Ask Afrika, and it's a whole new world opened up. It was incredible. I think that as a business, the opportunities are just incredible. So I really love just thriving, and I suppose that's where all of this sort of snowballed into.
Interesting.
One of 20 honorees, so I must mention the other 19. They're also incredible.
Amazing. So let's go back a little bit. So what is innovation research? How does that work?
Innovation research, sure. So basically, it's any sort of product that's in the market. So it can be currently in the market or a new product that's being launched that you test with potential customers or current customers. Obviously, making sure that you're not alienating any of your current customers. So again, very similar to CX. And then we also forecasted a lot, which I absolutely loved. So we could pull in the marketing plan, and with the marketing plan that we pulled in, we could then estimate how much a business can actually make from that.
Interesting.
From launching or relaunching in the space.
Right. So we're talking about generally consumer products, right?
FMCG mostly.
And there's a lot of a kind of an Africa specific lens to this, right? That the things that consumers want in Africa are going to be different than in North America or Europe. Do you have any examples? Like, how did that work? Like, was there a product where you were kind of like, this worked so well elsewhere, and then we tested it in Africa and we got to go a different direction?
Yeah. So I worked on quite a few multi-country studies. It was quite funny.
Okay.
So one of the multi-country studies, it was UK, Brazil, India, it was across the board.
Yeah.
And it was quite funny because most businesses assume that South Africa is going to sort of factor with something, like maybe Brazil or maybe India. And it was quite interesting because whenever we did the actual factor analysis, showing South Africa or other African countries, we always factored on our own.
Okay.
And global guys would always say, there must be something wrong here. There must be something wrong with the data. It's either the stats or someone's run something wrong. And actually, South Africa is just that different. And it's quite similar for other African markets. So, for example, we tested a specific product in Ghana, and it was a concept test, so it had imagery to it, and the Ghanaians immediately picked up that it wasn't a Ghanaian in the image. And a lot of people thought that they could just go and launch the same messaging with the same TVCs because, I mean, it's a lot more cost effective. And they immediately picked it up. And that's how nuanced the countries are. Even within African countries, they're completely nuanced. So some of the markets split into two halves almost, the way that you need to message within them. Yeah, it's incredible.
That's really interesting because I think a lot of companies will assume, at least, certain blocks of African countries, right? West Africa, you can kind of treat the same way. But no, you're going all the way down to Ghana, and they're actually able to see, wait, I can't relate to that for some reason.
Yeah.
And that goes to show you how important it is to test in each of these individual markets, right?
100%. You have to. And you have to provide their voice. That's the thing. And I suppose, I always come back to customer experience. That's the beauty of customer experience because that's what we're doing, right? We're giving people's voices within business. So you're amplifying people's voices in business, which I absolutely love.
So tell us a little bit about that transition. So you kind of started in, more of a kind of market research space, right? You are studying potential customers, but it's not necessarily kind of a traditional customer feedback, voice of the customer program. Tell us a little bit about how that journey went from kind of more traditional market research to becoming more of an expert on the CX or voice of customer side.
It's a very good question. And it was quite an interesting journey. It was kind of thrust upon me, I suppose. I was headhunted by a company and they work predominantly in customer experience. And I joined and it was my first introduction to NPS and the debate behind NPS. That was very interesting. Obviously learned a lot about customer experience very, very quickly. So if I just sort of map out the journey that I went on, I started in innovation and then moved across into business development. And within business development, I actually worked across the business. So I worked across like retail measurement, innovation, any form of traditional research, some forms of like media analysis. So across the board, just trying to get or gain experience as much as I could across any form of research that I possibly could. And then moved into customer experience when I was headhunted by a company, predominantly worked on voice of customer programs. So I also have a passion for tech. So it was also very exciting for me to be able to learn about the new technology that's in the space and how implementation happens. And I learned APIs and I decided to learn a little bit of Java. It was a very interesting journey that I went on. And then basically been in customer experience since then until I started the consulting division at Ask Afrika.
Makes sense. So tell me a little bit about that. I mean, obviously you've got a super curious mind. You like to dabble in a bunch of different areas. And then something kind of bubbled up around CX and the voice of customers. Some of it was also driven by this kind of agency coming to you and saying, hey, we want you to work here. But a lot of that is driven from some macroeconomic factor, right? They are also looking at it and saying, we need CX people because something is heating up. Was there something about the market here in South Africa or generally where like a lot more companies were wanting to run CX and VOC programs and they weren't able to without people like you?
Yeah, I think that customer experience in South Africa has moved fairly quickly. If I look at how the maturation of it over the past few years, just looking at the years that I've spent in it, it's moving at an incredibly fast pace. We've got incredible people from global, obviously, that do provide input. However, from a South African perspective, because of the nuance, it was so important for people to start focusing more heavily on customer experience. I did see it started actually becoming a lot more popular. And when I say more popular, I suppose I don't mean more popular within the CX space. I mean more popular within the business space.
Right.
So people started to learn more about putting the customer at the center across the business. And yeah, it did feel like, and it does still feel like, we're moving at a very, very fast pace and maturing very quickly. I mean, if I look at the amount of voice of customer programs that I launched in such a short space of time, it was a fair amount.
Yeah.
And it just shows that there's a need for it.
Yeah.
I suppose CX, we've proven that there's benefits in it. We've proven the benefits back to business.
Yeah.
And yeah.
And it just goes back to that old adage, right? That like it costs you a lot more money to go and try to earn a new customer than keeping your existing customers happy, right? And I think that's just been this kind of macro trend that people in South Africa and companies in South Africa are really now doubling down on. So tell us about that journey to Ask Afrika. How did you end up in Ask Afrika, and what do you do there?
Yeah, so sure, it's an incredible company. I think that it's one of the funnest is never the right word to use, but I always tend to use it, and I don't think it is actually a word. I suppose the opportunity that you have at Ask Afrika is quite broad. So we've got both Serena De Beer as well as Andrea Rodemeyer. That obviously Andrea Rodemeyer started the company, and their passion for people it just comes through in everything that we do. And I suppose you go from business to business, and you work at a company, and you have a passion for a company, and you align to their values. But sometimes you just find a company that really is the one that speaks your language, and I suppose that's what I found at Ask Afrika. And if I look at being able to actually start a consulting division within a research company,
right?
I mean, that was an incredible opportunity, and it's based in customer experience.
Right.
It's based in driving customer experience in South Africa forward in a different way, and using market research and using, I suppose, research and measurement as an integral part of that, and pulling everything together. So I suppose maybe I wouldn't say that I found Ask Afrika, but it found me and aligned to my values. We aligned in terms of values, and yeah, it was just an incredible opportunity that I couldn't pass up.
That makes sense.
Yeah.
Amazing. If that's the best opportunity, right? The ones that you just get pulled in, you're like, I can't stop this, right? It's a magnet. And so tell us a little bit more about kind of your role and what the day-to-day looks like in terms of what you do at Ask Afrika.
So from a consulting perspective, it's quite interesting because it can be quite varied. Obviously, we've got certain things that we do offer that are more traditional, so customer journey mapping. We also sort of do what I call experience workshops, which is quite interesting. So it's bringing the voice of the customer into a boardroom in a different way, as well as the voice of internal customers. So one of the things that I believe quite firmly is that everyone is a customer of someone else. So even if you're within a business, if you work in a certain department, you would generally be the customer of someone in a different department within that business. So approaching it in that way is quite important.
Interesting. And
often you need to speak a very different language depending on the business unit that you're working with. So if you're working with Black software developers, you need to speak a very different language versus speaking to executives or versus speaking to customer experience professionals, because the values that they have and what they are passionate about is quite different. Also what they do. So because of what they do, they speak a different language. So my husband's a software developer, so I kind of learned a little bit of the language and how to work with them a little bit from that relationship. And it is, I mean, you have to approach it very differently. So from a consulting perspective, I suppose we help with that. Yeah, we also provide, I mean, just the strategic impact. And then from an Ask Afrika perspective, the nice thing is that we've got the Ask Afrika Orange Index, which is the broadest, most widely used strategic benchmark in South Africa. So we run it across a lot of industries, and being able to use that as a base to actually start to inform business and say, well, this is where you rank versus another business. How can we get you to improve? How can we get your customer experience to improve? Yeah, so that's what we do.
Interesting.
And we also should I say own, we run and we partner very closely with Target Group Index. So the Ask Africa TGI is the biggest usage and attitude study in South Africa, which is incredible to be able to leverage off of. Because if you think about it, when you're looking at customer, right, you need to know who the customer is. And generally businesses need to do a lot of like U&A studies, but we've got a lot of the information, so we leverage that a lot.
Right.
So we try to sort of leverage as much of what is already there, so that there's a lot of benefit to the companies that we work with.
Makes sense.
Yeah.
I mean, we're getting some really great questions from the audience, and keep them coming. I think this is a good segue into one of them around, how the market in Africa might be different, right? That there is lower technology penetration, there's less people online. How does that kind of change your approach? You kind of mentioned that the employee might be kind of a little bit more of a key stakeholder, and some of these benchmarks might matter more. How do you approach this problem, knowing that in Africa, just a large portion of people aren't using the same digital channels that people are using elsewhere?
It's a very good question. I suppose it comes back again to who the customer is. And we have to fit the solution back to the customer.
Right.
Because at the end of the day, what you're trying to do within CX is you're trying to put the customer at the center of your business. One of the things that is almost a misconception in Africa is that a lot of African markets have low internet penetration, and some of them actually don't. Some of them are quite advanced. You'll be surprised, which is quite interesting. So we need to obviously approach those countries in a slightly different way. But I mean, if you think about implementing a customer experience strategy, you need to map out the journeys that the customers go on. Right. So if I'm in a market with a very low internet penetration, chances of me using an app or using online is quite low. So when we look at it from that perspective, we would then need to adapt the way that we approach voice of the customer. Because you obviously, if a customer is interacting in branch, as an example, so I always go face to face, you can't then survey me online. Send me an email, and we face that quite often. So we're currently running a multi-country Africa study, and we have a similar problem in that. We initially, I mean, from a cost perspective, email surveying is always like a good option. However, the response rates are so incredibly low that, I mean, cost benefits weighing up, it sometimes doesn't make sense. So we kind of have to look at what are the means that the customers are using. Are they using email? Are they using online? Are they using any form of internet? And then base the solution around that and design it around that.
And that makes complete sense, right? Every business is working with their customer in some way, right? There's some touch point that you're interacting with your customer. And so that's kind of the starting point, right? Is that, hey, if most of our interactions are happening in branch, okay, well then how does that translate to a VOC program? Is it an offline device kiosk that's there in the branch itself, right? And that's how you're kind of collecting the data. Or is it comment cards? Or did you collect some piece of information at that, that branch? A mobile number, a email address, a physical mailing address that then you can use to kind of power the actual strategy. So in some ways, it's a good lead into, like, where does the strategy start, right? When you bring on a new client and you think about, okay, this is the best practice in terms of coming up with a CX strategy, how do you approach that? Is it a similar approach in many cases? How do you think about setting a good CX strategy to begin with?
So you need to obviously have a recipe first, because I mean it gets to a point where it's how long is a piece of string. But just before we move on, when you were just busy asking the question, something came to mind, and I suppose it's almost like the ideal. So in an ideal world, if I look at in person, so if I look at in branch, what I hope in the future is going to happen, and obviously it might be years in the future, it might not be too far in the future, is almost live tracking of experience. So if we look at, if I go into in person, so let's say I go into like a real retail store, I go into a bank or a branch, if we're tracking that person's facial expressions, their responses to things, because generally you can see if a person is having a good time or not, and you adapt the customer's experience based off of what's happening in that moment. From a measurement perspective, it would look slightly different. So you're still leveraging tech, but you wouldn't need to survey as much. So you wouldn't need to ask, are you satisfied with the experience? Post the interaction, you can almost gauge it in that. And an example always comes to mind that a lot of people use, and I don't know if you've heard, if you know about it, but the way that Disney brings magic in the theme parks. Do you know how they do it?
I know vaguely, but I want to hear from you.
So it's quite interesting because their promise, and I suppose it also comes back to the brand promise. So what are you promising as a brand? And Disney promises magic, right? So that's their premise. And apparently what they do now, I've never visited Disney, I would love to. But apparently what they do is they actually, when you enter the theme park, they say they monitor everything. So everything is recorded, everything that happens in the park is completely recorded. And what they will then do is, let's say, for example, Cinderella is standing there and Cinderella has an earpiece in, and there's a family walking towards her. What then happens is there's a person that's obviously talking in her earpiece, and that person is then telling her who this family is. So these are the Joneses that are walking up. They've just flown in from New York. Currently it's raining in New York. It's the little girl's birthday. Her name is Sophia, as an example. And Cinderella immediately knows everything there is to know about this family. And the first interaction that they have with her is her saying, "Oh, welcome, Joneses." She's been standing there the whole time. How does she know that it's them? And then she goes on to give details about things that would make that interaction magical, like, "Happy birthday, Sophia. I know that it's your birthday." And I suppose from a customer experience perspective, getting to that point, whether it's in branch, whether it's in any form of engagement, and yes, it might be very difficult to do and might be very far in the future. But I'm excited to see where it goes.
But that's where everything is heading, even with the way that you implement CX strategies today, right? So I think you've kind of talked about two key portions of what I think about in a CX program, right? One is touch points, and then one is data, right? So on one hand, like the example that you just gave, like that's a completely offline touch point, right? It's Cinderella talking to a family in person at the park. But what enabled that was all of the data that Disneyland was able to bring in through the background, right? And the technology that enables that. So even though it was an offline touch point, it was actually without the CRM system, without the integration, without them being able to pull all of that data at the right time to the right person, you would have never been able to create that touch point. So tell us a little bit more about, like, where does that data element come in? Like when you think about rolling out a CX program, so you've talked a little bit about the touch points. What are those touch points? What's the data aspect of it, right? When you're putting a survey out there or trying to collect data on a certain touch point, are you making sure that you're bringing data from what the company already knows about that customer into that experience? How does that work?
Definitely. So you have to integrate. So I know that from a data perspective, I mean, there's usually a wealth of data. So you usually have a lot of information about the person that you're surveying or the interaction that happened. A lot of companies don't, interestingly. So a lot of companies don't actually capture it, which is also, it's a challenge on its own. But I believe in leveraging as much of what there is as possible. Because me as a customer, if I receive a survey and I get asked questions that the company should know about me, firstly, I'm South African, I'm not going to trust it. So I'm going to immediately go, you should know this. So this is definitely not a link I'm clicking on. Or this is not, you're going to ask me for bank details. Mistrust. But secondly, from an experience perspective, implementing and executing customer experience is an experience on its own. So you're not only providing an experience in terms of the interaction that's happening. So I ask for something to happen and I'm getting that task completed. I'm then getting a survey post that or getting an engagement post that to provide feedback. That's an experience on its own, and you have to approach it in that way.
Makes sense.
A lot of companies don't, and they approach it in the way of, we need information, so let me get more information from this person. And sometimes what happens, and the reason why that, or I suppose maybe it's not the reason, sorry, I'm a researcher, so I always have to catch myself before I say something is definite. A potential reason for that happening is that sometimes we take the heart out of measurement.
Right.
So sometimes
Right.
we implement something because we need a score. At the end of the day, we need to measure.
Yeah.
If you're not measuring, you don't know if you're
Right.
succeeding, right? So
Right.
that's rule number one, measurement, smart rules, implement it always. But the measurement needs to have heart behind it.
Right.
And if I look at in South Africa, and the Ask Africa Orange Index actually shows that emotion has become more important than just delivering the functional need, which is very interesting.
Interesting.
And that emotional measurement is also important. So it's kind of like approaching the implementation that you do with the heart that you have, and then with the business outcomes, and tying it all together almost as a puzzle piece.
That's it.
Yeah.
That's, I mean, it's, I love, and you know, it's amazing to think about some of the words that we're talking about, right? Magic, heart, emotions. This has to be at the core. And, you know, I think one of our attendees is saying, oh my God, I thought it was magic. But in some ways, you know, it can be as simple that it's about using the data that you already have in creative ways, right? So, and you know, I think some of the scenarios that you're painting are maybe a ways out, right? In terms of what people can do with facial tracking and determining emotions. But a lot of what you're talking about, I think, are very basic things that a lot of people on this webinar can actually kind of implement tomorrow, right? That you see so many VOC surveys out there. You know, let's take a car example, right? Somebody walks out of the dealership, you send them a survey. How was your experience buying that car? And the first question is, what car did you buy? Well, you already know that, right? And not only do you know that, so that's like foundational, right? That's just to build the trust. But then there's the emotional level, which is not only do we already know what car you wanted to buy, but we know that mileage was the top decision-making factor, right? And so in that touch point, we're actually going to say, hey, how are you feeling the mileage is after, you know, driving this for 30 days, right? And then that becomes part of the experience that, hey, this brand actually knows what I care about. And now the brand is able to measure that better. And as a respondent to that survey, you're still only answering one or two questions. But the brand is getting way more data in the back end because now they can kind of subsect things by, okay, people who cared about mileage, this is how they felt. People who cared about speed, this is how they felt. People who care about how many people can I fit in the bag, this is how they score. So is that kind of what you're getting at here in terms of how people can approach implementing these types of CX programs?
No, definitely. You have to leverage everything that you have. So if you have any information internally that's going to streamline that experience, that's going to reduce frustration, or just make the person, it's sort of, I suppose, closing off the overall experience, because at the end of the day, you're not just asking because you want to know how satisfied they are. You're asking because you want to bring their voice into the organization. You're prioritizing them as a customer, and you're putting their voice first. You're putting their, and I suppose when we approach it in that way, it's a slightly different. I want to take part in the survey because you're doing it not out of do you know what I mean? Like you're doing it with a different purpose, I suppose, with a different meaning behind it. And I think that's what's important.
I think that's the approach everybody's got to take, right? I mean, I think everybody on this call has had some customer survey, and that's all it is, right? It's just a survey. And you're like, I don't care. I don't want to fill this out. This is actually making me feel worse about the brand. And just a little bit of a different perspective, right? I mean, I love the things that we've talked about in this session. Magic, you know, emotion, using data to fuel that. And just by changing your approach a little bit, you can really set yourself apart in terms of the quality of the data you're collecting, in terms of the response rates that you're getting, and most importantly, actually how you made that person feel who filled out the survey on the other end, right? That actually this survey was not just me as a brand or a company wanting something from you, wanting some information from you, but it's actually made you feel even better about the brand because you got something back, right? The same way that at Disneyland, you know, the princess was able to say, welcome to warm, sunny Orlando. I know it's raining in New York today, right? And if you can put that at the top of your survey, it's not actually that hard, right? That's actually a piece of magic that everybody on this call could think about, right? Is just to tap in and say, you know what, the top of that survey, how do you say something unique to that person, that keeps them engaged, that provides the ability for them to want to give you high quality data, and increases the relationship between the brand and that customer. Wow, that's way more than collecting customer feedback, right? That's a whole different perspective on how to use these touch points to actually build the brand, build the relationship. It's amazing. I think so many people think about CX as it's just a way to collect data and get a customer satisfaction score, but this is actually a completely different way to look at it.
I suppose if I had to leave with one question for everyone that you can almost ask yourself when you're implementing anything, I suppose even just in an engagement, ask yourself, how do you want that person to feel when they leave that interaction? So from an experience perspective, from a survey perspective, market research, customer experience, anything, how do you want that person to leave? And what do you want them to remember about the engagement that you've had with them? And answering that question brings you right down to your purpose. It brings you right down to, why are we doing this? What are we going to use it for? It's,
I just think that's complete gold, right? Because at the end of the day, I think so many people think about voice of customer as CX as, I want to measure how you already felt. But nobody thinks about, how do I use this touch point to make you feel even better about us at the end of the day, right? We still want good, unbiased data, but this is a touch point that you can actually bring somebody closer to your brand. You can bring delight, you can bring magic, you can bring that kind of emotional spur. Amazing. Well, this has been such an enlightening session. Thank you everybody for joining us. Kendall, thank you for being here. And for those of you that are looking for help on how to bring magic and delight and emotion to a good CX or VAOC program, go check out what Kendall and Ask Afrika are doing. It's an amazing company. It's been such a pleasure working with you over the last few months and developing this partnership. And we're excited to work together even more and learn even more. And hopefully everybody got some good insights here. So Kendall, again, thanks so much for coming on the show and being our first to actually do this live. It's been a pleasure to be in South Africa.
Yeah, thank you so much. It really was. It was a lot of fun. Thank you.
Absolutely. And thanks everyone for joining.